The Duke of Ravenhurst seized Charlotte by the elbow before she could finish her curtsy, and walked her straight toward the stallion that had broken 3 grooms since Easter. She did not pull away. She did not speak. She let him march her across the gravel of the upper yard, past the open mouths of the dairymaids, past the head groom's frozen hand on a halter rope, past the wide blue eyes of the boy who was supposed to be sweeping. The skirt of her plain grey dress was wet to the knee from the morning grass, and her white apron strings bore 3 stitched repairs. Her pale gold hair had escaped its pin near the temple, and the loose strand brushed her cheek as he marched her forward. She was 26 years old, ivory-skinned and travel-weary, and she did not look like a woman about to be humbled. She looked like a woman calculating which fence she would clear first. Tempest rolled the white of one eye at them and laid his ears flat to his neck. He stood 17 hands at the shoulder, the deep glossy black of polished obsidian, with a star like a dropped lantern between his eyes. He had thrown the Duke's best rider at the Easter trials and broken the man's collarbone in 2 places. He had refused saddle, bridle, and farrier in any combination since. The head groom, Mr. Holloway, had spent the past 4 mornings trying to convince his lordship to sell the animal to a circus before he killed someone proper. "You will mount him," the Duke said. He had not yet released her elbow. "My lord." "You will mount him, Miss Merritt, and you will hold your seat for 1 full circuit of the yard, and at the end of that circuit you will dismount, and you will tell every soul on this estate that the wisdom of stable boys is no concern of housemaids. Do you understand?" It was not a question. Charlotte Merritt looked up at him. Theodore Kane, 8th Duke of Ravenhurst, was 28 years old and had the height and breadth of a man who had spent 2 seasons hunting in the Highlands and the rest of his time outdoors with horses. His coat was a deep indigo wool, his cravat the color of cream, and his hair the dark, warm brown of a chestnut soaked in tea. He had a jaw a sculptor would have argued over. He had the kind of grey eyes that looked clear from a distance and went storm-coloured when he was angry, which he had been since approximately 7 o'clock that morning, when his steward had reported overhearing a kitchen maid telling a stable boy that the colt called Hercules had a throat infection coming on and ought not be worked. The colt called Hercules had developed a throat infection by noon. The Duke had not slept all night. He had paced his library at dawn. He had decided that whatever the maid was, she was not staying in his household to make a fool of his stable-master and his head farrier and his master of horse, all of whom he paid handsomely to know more about his animals than a girl with a scrubbing pail. He had decided to humble her in the only currency she appeared to traffic in. He had not slept enough to think the plan all the way through. "My lord," Charlotte said again, and her voice was not the voice of a woman about to make a scene. It was a low, quiet voice, almost gentle, with a clean Yorkshire vowel beneath the polish. "If I mount him in this skirt, I will tear it, and the housekeeper will dock my wages." "I will pay for the skirt." "Then I shall require a leg up, my lord. The stallion is too tall for me to spring." He stared at her. He had been prepared for tears, fainting, a flat refusal. He had even, somewhere underneath the anger, half hoped for a flat refusal. He had not been prepared for practical questions. He found that he had nothing in his mouth that could be released as a sentence, and so he set both his hands at her waist and lifted her, and her hands closed on the stallion's mane as she settled astride. She did not arrange her skirts. She did not adjust her grip. She did not reach for the reins, which were dangling unattached from a snaffle that had not yet been buckled. She simply settled her weight, all 8 stone of it, into the small of the great black animal's back, as if she were settling onto a chair by the kitchen fire. She breathed out once, slowly, through her nose. Tempest's ears came forward. The dairymaids made a small, soft sound, none of them aware of having made it. Charlotte leaned, almost imperceptibly, towards his right shoulder. The stallion turned. He walked. He walked the perimeter of the upper yard at a measured walk that any drilling sergeant would have wept to see. His great black neck arched, his ears twitching at the rhythm of her quiet body. She made a click with her tongue at the cobbles. He picked up a long-paced trot. She closed her left knee a hair tighter. He balanced. She drew the smallest breath. He halted, exactly at the Duke's boots, and lowered his head and breathed warm into the Duke's lapel. Charlotte slid down. Her skirt did not tear. She had taken it up neatly under her sash before he had even thought to look. She handed him the strand of mane she had been holding, the way a child hands a sweet wrapper to its mother. "My lord," she said, "I beg leave to return to my duties. The first floor still wants polishing, and cook will be looking for me at past." She curtsied. She walked, exactly as straight-backed as she had walked out, towards the kitchen door. The Duke of Ravenhurst stood in the cold spring sunshine with the breath of his unrideable stallion soft on his cravat, and watched her go, and discovered that the burning sensation under his collar was not anger anymore. He could not, just at that moment, identify what it had become. Mr. Holloway found his voice first. The head groom asked, very carefully, whether his lordship would like the stallion put up. The Duke did not answer. He set his hand on Tempest's neck instead. The stallion did not flinch. The stallion, in fact, leaned slightly into the touch, the way a hound leans against a knee. The Duke had owned him for 2.5 years, and the stallion had never leaned into anything in his life. The Duke recovered himself enough, after a long pause, to issue 2 quiet instructions. He wanted every account of every household servant hired in the last 12 months brought to his study before luncheon. He wanted not a word of this in the village. The head groom looked at the dairymaids, who were already vanishing back into the dairy with the hectic energy of women who had a great deal of news to deliver before the bells rang noon. He looked at the wide-eyed sweeping boy. He looked at the kitchen door, which had just closed behind a small, straight-backed maid in a wet grey dress. He inclined his head, with the gentle resignation of a man who had been managing horses for 40 years and had accepted, several decades ago, that he could not manage gossip, and undertook to do what he could. Cook did not shout. Cook never shouted. Cook simply set down the wooden spoon with which he had been beating eggs and looked at Charlotte over the rims of her spectacles for the precise length of time required to make a kitchen of 7 people go entirely still. She informed Charlotte, in her most measured voice, that there was a story being told in her still room which she did not propose to repeat in front of the undercook. There was a further story being told in the dairy, which had already reached the pantry and the laundry, and, as of 3 minutes ago, the gardener's boy. There was a third story coming up the back corridor on the legs of Mrs. Thane the housekeeper, and Mrs. Thane the housekeeper, Cook observed, was not a woman she proposed to keep waiting. Charlotte stood with her hands folded over her apron and her eyes a polite half-inch above Cook's left shoulder. She replied, levelly, that his lordship had asked her to ride a horse. She had ridden the horse. She had come back to polish the first floor. Cook, who had buried 2 husbands and a son, and had run a kitchen in every great house between Carlisle and York, looked at Charlotte for a long, quiet second. "Polish the first floor, Miss Merritt," she said at last. "Begin in the long gallery. Do not, under any circumstances, walk past the open door of his lordship's study. There will be a hot dinner waiting at 4. And Charlotte—" Cook paused over the eggs, and the kitchen paused with her. "Whoever you were before you came here is no business of mine. Polish well." Charlotte allowed herself, for the first time that morning, a small private pulse of feeling somewhere behind her sternum. She inclined her head. She fetched the beeswax and the soft cloths and the long-handled brush from the still-room cupboard, and she went up the back stairs to polish the long gallery, and she did not allow her hands to tremble even when she was alone. The long gallery at Ravenhurst was 140 feet long. It ran the length of the south wing and held the family portraits and a yellowing parquet floor that smelled, when warmed by the spring sun through the tall sash windows, exactly the way she had smelled childhood. Beeswax, dust, lavender from the linen press across the corridor, and the faint mineral cool of stone behind the wainscot. She knelt at the south end. She set out her cloths. She began at the skirting and worked her way up. The morning light fell in long, lemon-coloured rectangles across the floor and broke against the ankles of the gentlemen in the portraits, who watched her without comment. Some of them, she thought, would have been displeased to see a maid in this gallery polishing badly. None of them, she suspected, had ever met a maid in this gallery polishing well. She did not yet know that the Duke of Ravenhurst was, at that moment, watching her cross the inner court from the window of his study, and that he had set down a glass of brandy he had not poured for himself, and that he had been standing at that window for the past 40 minutes, with an expression on his face that his valet, who had brought him a fresh cravat at 2:20 and had withdrawn, unnoticed, had decided not to disturb. He summoned her at 3 in the afternoon. She came in her plain grey, her apron freshly tied, the smell of beeswax under her nails. The study was high-ceilinged and lined with horse paintings, Stubbs at the south wall, a marshal hunter over the mantel, a small unsigned watercolour above the desk that she recognized at once and chose not to look at twice. There was a fire, there was a tea tray, there was a single chair set on her side of the great mahogany desk, which she did not sit in, because no maid sat in the presence of her master. The Duke did not ask her to sit. He had not yet decided whether he wanted her on her feet or in his lap, and the second of those thoughts was a thought he had not asked permission of his own brain to have. He let her stand in the warm silence for a long moment before he spoke. The clock on the chimney-piece marked 3:30 with a small, flat strike. A coal shifted in the grate. Charlotte counted 4 breaths in the careful, slow rhythm she had practiced 6 years ago, on the morning she had stood for the first time in front of the house steward at her first place of service, and had answered every question without permitting her face to give him anything. He asked her, eventually, whose daughter she was. She answered that she was the daughter of a Yorkshire schoolmaster who had passed when she was 12. He asked after her mother. She answered that her mother had been the schoolmaster's wife and had not survived him by long. He asked where she had spent the intervening years. She answered that she had been in service, my lord. All of them. He waited. She did not elaborate. He had been in 3 parliaments, owned 11,000 acres, and had sat across from a French diplomat for 90 minutes during the closing of a treaty. He had never, in his life, encountered a silence as polite and as immovable as Charlotte Merritt standing on the other side of his desk, with her hands folded, and her eyes trained at the 3rd button of his waistcoat. He observed, after a small pause, that she rode. She agreed that she did. He observed that she had ridden very well. She agreed, with a quiet courtesy that gave him nothing to push against, that her father had kept a small mare for the village, and that she had exercised her on the lanes. He set his pen down. He told her, dryly, that Tempest was not a small village mare. No, my lord. He is a Godolphin descendant on the dam side, and a Darley on the sire, of 15 3/4, and he has not been gelded because his lordship has been holding him at stud. Her voice did not change. He is also currently underweight in his hindquarters, because he is being worked at full ration on cracked corn, my lord, when he has the digestion of a thoroughbred, and ought to be on bran mash twice a week, and rolled oats only thereafter. But I imagine your stable master is aware. The Duke set his pen down very carefully on its tray. Miss Merritt, my lord, that is not the answer of a Yorkshire schoolmaster's daughter. It is the answer of a woman who has paid attention, my lord. It is the answer, the Duke said, of a woman who is trained on Newmarket Heath. She did not answer. Miss Merritt. My lord, I beg you will let me return to my duties. The 3rd floor has not been done since Lady Day. You will answer me. I have answered you, my lord. I have answered every question you have asked. If your lordship would put me a different question, I will answer that one as well. The Duke leaned back in his chair. His eyes had gone the colour of a sky just before rain. He had, in the past 2 hours, sent for the household ledger the housekeeper's references file, and his own steward. And he had read that one Charlotte Merritt had been engaged at Ravenhurst 11 months ago, on the personal recommendation of a milliner in York. The milliner had said only that the girl was honest, dexterous, and prepared to work for a half-wage with no afternoons. "You will," he said, "do me the courtesy of not pretending to me that you are an ordinary maid." She lifted her eyes for the first time. They were grey, the clear, level grey of a winter sky over a stone wall, and they met his without flinching. "I am extraordinarily a maid, my lord," she said. "I am a maid extraordinarily well. If you find that intolerable, I will collect my character, and I will be on the carrier's cart by morning." "That is not what I said." "It is what your lordship's tone said." A small, hot silence stood between them across the broad, polished mahogany. The Duke did not move. Charlotte did not move. The clock on the chimney-piece ticked through 20 seconds in which neither of them looked away. He was the first to lower his eyes, to the open ledger on his desk, to a name in the third column that he had been staring at for 20 minutes without absorbing. And he told her, at last, in a voice carefully empty of everything, that she might return to her duties. She curtsied. She withdrew. The door shut very softly behind her, and the Duke listened to the soft retreat of her steps along the long, carpeted gallery for as long as he could distinguish them, and then, somewhat longer. And then he set both hands flat on the desk and bowed his head. The Duke of Ravenhurst sat for a long time looking at the painting above his desk, which was a watercolour his old master, the late Henry Merritt of Newmarket, had given him on the occasion of his first colt to a winning post. It was a study of a dappled grey foal with a white star, drawn from life in a north paddock at first light. The signature in the corner was a child's looped C, Merritt. His master had had a niece. He remembered her now. He had met her once when she had been 12 years old and serious, in a pinafore with horsehair on the cuffs. He sat with his hand over his mouth, and the cold spring afternoon went very slowly past his window. There was a child at Ravenhurst. She was Lady Beatrice Kane, 10 years old, the orphaned daughter of the Duke's late brother, and she had appointed herself to Charlotte's company within 14 hours of Charlotte's arrival the previous spring. She had been deposed, briefly, when her cousin discovered the friendship, and ordered her governess to keep her at her French verbs in the mornings. She had been reinstated within a week, because Lady Beatrice Kane, at 10 years old, already had the political instinct of a duchess, and the persistence of a pony with an unbarred door. She found Charlotte in the long gallery at 4:30, with the polishing cloths. She had ridden Tempest, Beatrice announced, without preamble, without greeting, the way she announced most things. She would not be told otherwise, since the second housemaid had told the first housemaid, and the first housemaid had told Miss Pritchett, the governess, and Miss Pritchett had told the boot boy, and the boot boy had informed Lady Beatrice at 12 minutes past noon. Charlotte said quietly that she had been instructed not to speak of it. Beatrice asked by whom. Charlotte said by Mrs. Bickle. Beatrice waved this aside as a matter of the gravest unimportance. Cook did not signify. She, Beatrice, was the Duke's ward, and Charlotte was her friend, and Charlotte had done a great and historic thing, and she required to be told whether her cousin had been an ass about it. Charlotte set the cloth down. She knelt on the rug and tied Beatrice's left bootlace, which had been undone for some time and had been distressing her dignity considerably. "His lordship," she said carefully, "has been a duke about it." Beatrice translated this with the unsentimental clarity of a child, which meant an ass. She wished to know whether Charlotte had done it on purpose. She clarified before Charlotte could ask. Had she ridden the stallion on purpose, knowing that she would humiliate him in front of all his stablemen, and that he would be looking out of his window at 3 o'clock, thinking that he had behaved very poorly indeed? Charlotte tied the second lace. She straightened. Beatrice's face was small and serious and intelligent, and dirty in the particular places along the jaw that 10-year-olds favoured for getting dirty. She had ridden the stallion, Charlotte said, because she had been told to ride the stallion. She was paid by his lordship to do as she was told. Beatrice, untroubled by the metaphysics of the answer, observed that Charlotte was paid £8 a year and that her cousin could double it tomorrow. Charlotte agreed that he could. Beatrice asked, with the directness only 10-year-olds and very old men permitted themselves, whether Charlotte would let him. Charlotte gathered her cloths. She tucked one under her arm. She looked at the small, fierce child at her elbow and felt, for the first time since Halford had ruined her uncle and her name and her future on the same Friday afternoon at Tattersall's 6 years ago, a small, uncomplicated wish. "Lady Beatrice," she said, "I will let your cousin do the things that make sense. I will not let him do the things that do not. I have learned the difference." Beatrice considered this. She nodded once, as a duchess would have done. Beatrice wished, of course, to be taught to ride Tempest. Charlotte refused. She enumerated her reasons gently as she walked to the next portrait. Tempest was not a horse for a child. She herself was not a riding mistress. If his lordship caught her at the lesson, he would dismiss her. And she had developed, over the past 11 months, a fondness for her £8 a year. Beatrice considered this. She would ask her cousin for a proper riding mistress then. Charlotte agreed that this was a very good plan. Beatrice added that she would ask after dinner, when he had had a glass of port and was in a better humour. Charlotte replied that this was strategically considered. "Merit?" "My lady." "He likes you, you know." Charlotte's hands closed on the polishing cloths. "Lady Beatrice, your cousin has not yet decided what he thinks of me. It would be improper of me to have an opinion in advance of his lordship's." "He likes you," said the small, dirty, serious child, "because he could not stop looking out of the window for the whole morning." She was in the stables at first light because she could not sleep. She had lain awake in the small, dim room above the kitchens that she shared with a chambermaid named Annie and a kitchen maid named Bess, listening to Annie's slow, regular breathing and the ticking of the iron bedstead and the small, wet ticking of an early rain on the slate above her head. She had thought of her uncle. She had thought of her own hands. She had thought of the Duke's hands at her waist, lifting her, and of how lightly he had done it, as though her weight had not surprised him. She had thought of his eyes going storm-coloured in the courtyard, and of his eyes immediately afterwards going still. She had thought of the colt called Hercules and his fevered nostrils. At 3 o'clock she had given up. At 3:15, she had pulled on her dress and her stockings and her boots in the dark, careful not to wake Annie, and she had taken the back stairs in her stockinged feet and put her boots on at the bottom. It was the kind of dawn the Yorkshire dales gave grudgingly in late April. A slow blue hush over the wet hay, a cold hush in the rafters, the smell of clean straw and warm bran, and the low, contented groan of a stall door working on its hinges. Somewhere in the high beams, a barn owl that had not yet retired turned its great pale face and watched her come in, and decided, after a private deliberation, that she did not signify. Charlotte was meant to be 3 floors away, polishing the morning-room grate before cook came down at 5:30. She had, instead, walked down the back stairs in her grey dress and her oldest boots, and she had let herself in through the side door of the stable block, and she had gone to Hercules's stall, because the colt that had been brewing a throat infection yesterday morning would, by now, be running a hard fever. He was. She could hear it in his breathing before she saw him. The low, rasping pull and the small wet click at the back of the throat that meant an inflammation had passed from the ducts into the airway proper. She did not need to put her hand to him to know. She let herself in. The colt knew her. She had been quietly leaving him a half-handful of cooked linseed every other afternoon for a month, on her way back from emptying the slop pail. He pressed his fevered nose into her shoulder and let her open his mouth, and his throat was as red as a coal, and his glands were the size of plums. She went to the medicine cupboard. It was unlocked, which she had known. She made up a steam, boiling water from the small stable forge stove, eucalyptus oil from a brown bottle, a fistful of dried thyme she had set by herself last September, and a dose of belladonna in 12 drops of brandy, because Hercules's pulse was running thready under his jaw. She covered him with a clean blanket. She set the bucket of steam under his nose and held a sack tented over his head and her own. She was crouched there, breathing in the eucalyptus and the warm horse and the wet straw, when a man's quiet voice spoke behind her in the stall door. "Miss Merritt." She did not jump. She finished what she was doing. She did not lift the sack until she had counted to 30, and Hercules's nostrils had stopped flaring. The Duke of Ravenhurst was in his shirt sleeves. She had never seen him in his shirt sleeves. He had clearly come straight from his own bed. His hair was uncombed. His cravat was nowhere to be seen. The linen of his shirt was open at the throat and had a fold across the breast that suggested he had pulled it on without troubling his valet. He had a glass of brandy in one hand, because he had not yet been able to face the morning sober, and a riding crop in the other, because he had been on his way to Tempest. He looked, Charlotte thought distantly, less like a duke and more like a man. He asked her, in a voice tightly held, what in God's name she was doing. She told him, evenly, that she was steaming Hercules. The colt was running a throat infection, the same one she had mentioned to the stable boy the previous morning. He observed that she was dosing his colt with belladonna. She agreed that she was. 12 drops in a spirit base. The colt would not feel it. He was 200 guineas of thoroughbred running a 40-degree fever, and the alternative was calling out the farrier surgeon at Beverley, who was 90 minutes' ride away and would charge a guinea besides. The Duke set the brandy glass down, very deliberately, on the corn bin lid. He asked her where she had learned to compound a steam from eucalyptus, brandy, and 12 drops of belladonna. She did not answer. He asked her again. The lamp on the wall guttered briefly in the cold draught from the open stable door. Hercules's breathing, under the steam, had begun to ease. The Duke did not move. She straightened. She set the empty bottles back into the medicine cupboard. She closed the cupboard. She turned to face him in the dim blue light of the stable lamp. "At Newmarket, my lord," she said. "On the heath, in the spring of the year that I was 15. From a man who had been compounding it for 40 years, and who had used the same compound on a Derby winner the year before they took his name out of the books, as you very well know." The Duke of Ravenhurst put his hand against the door jamb. He breathed in once, slowly. He looked, to Charlotte, very much like a man who had ridden through a long night to arrive somewhere he had not expected. He said, after a careful interval, that Henry Merritt had been his master. She agreed. He said that Merritt had given him his first winner. She agreed again, and added, after a moment, that she had been there. He looked at her. She had been 12, she told him. She had poured the syllabub at the celebration dinner. He had spilled some on his father's good cravat, and her uncle had laughed. Her uncle had liked him. Her uncle had told her afterwards that the young cane boy had the right hands and the wrong friends, and that he would do well in life if he got rid of the friends. Charlotte. It was the first time he had used her given name. She felt it against her sternum. "My lord?" "Why are you scrubbing my floors?" "Because, my lord," she said very quietly, "the man who ruined my uncle is a friend of every great house between London and York, and I have learned that the only safe place for the niece of Henry Merritt is below the level at which men like him bother to look. I have been below that level for 6 years. I had 3 weeks left on my engagement at Ravenhurst. I would have been gone, and your lordship would have remained in ignorance of me, and I would have been in another county before Sir Lucian Halford rode through your gates next month for the spring meeting. Which he is, my lord, planning to do. I read his letter to your steward by accident in February, when I was emptying a wastebasket." The Duke closed his eyes. When he opened them, he had set the riding crop aside, and he had stepped fully into the stall, and he had taken her cold hand in his warm one, as if it were a thing he had been intending to do for a long time. He told her, with the simplicity of a man who had been working a sentence over for several hours and had, at last, hit upon its plain form, that she would not be on the carrier's cart by morning. She tried once to interrupt. He did not let her. She would not be on the carrier's cart by morning, he repeated, and she would not be in another county by spring, and she would not be below the level at which men like Halford bothered to look, ever again, for one further day. She tried to tell him he did not understand. He told her, with a small, dry deliberation, that he understood very well, that the previous morning he had lifted his master's niece onto a stallion for the express purpose of humiliating her in front of 7 of his servants, and that he had been awake since 2 o'clock that morning, trying to compose the apology he was about to pay her. She began to say that he owed her no apology. He cut her off gently. He owed her, he said, an apology of considerable size. The cold Hercules snuffled into his sleeve. The Duke did not move his hand from hers. He asked her, after another long pause, whether she would take charge of his stables. She refused without hesitation. She was not a man, she told him, and his stablemaster was, and the day he put a maid over a man in the stable yard was the day Mr. Holloway resigned his place and wrote a letter to the sporting magazine that would ruin them both. He asked then under what terms she would stay. She looked at him. She looked at the dawn light coming pale and blue through the high stable window. She looked at her own hand, which was still in his, and which she did not particularly wish to remove. "Under the terms," she said, "of a salaried stable assistant, my lord. Openly. Not under Mr. Holloway, but beside him, and answerable only to your lordship. £25 a year. A small room of my own off the saddle store with a key. A condition of my engagement that I am not to be required to wear an apron, or to address Mr. Holloway as Sir, or to remove myself from the yard when a gentleman caller arrives. And one further condition, my lord, on which I will not yield." "Name it." "That, when Sir Lucian Halford arrives at your gate next month, you will not pretend you do not know who I am." He thought about it for the space of 2 breaths. Sir Lucian Halford, he answered, would be received by his butler, escorted to the morning room, made to wait 24 minutes while his lordship finished a letter, and then informed that the Duke of Ravenhurst's stable assistant, Miss Charlotte Merritt, niece of the late Henry Merritt of Newmarket, was unfortunately too busy with the spring foaling to attend upon him. He asked, with one eyebrow lifted half a hair, whether that would suit. She did not allow her smile. She nodded, the smallest nod a woman could nod, and answered, very quietly, that it would suit very well. She moved her things into the small room off the saddle store at noon. The room had been a tack cleaner's berth in the previous Duke's day, 12 feet by 9, with a single high window facing east over the inner court, and a narrow iron bed and a deal washstand and a small cracked pier glass on the far wall. The walls were whitewashed plaster that had gone slightly cream with age. The floor was scrubbed boards. The window had been left open all morning by Mr. Holloway's youngest stable boy, who had been dispatched to air it on the Duke's particular instructions, and the room smelled of saddle soap and old leather and clean wood and, faintly, of the lavender bag the boy had decided on his own initiative to set on the pillow. Charlotte had paused in the doorway when she first came in, with her uncle's valise in one hand and her mother's wooden box in the other, and she had looked at the lavender bag for several seconds before she had set down her things and walked across to the high window and leaned out, briefly, into the cool spring air, and laughed once, very quietly, into her own sleeve. There was almost nothing to move. A canvas valise that had once been her uncle's, a wooden box with a blue ribbon worn pale that had been her mother's, a bundle of letters she had not opened in 5 years, a worn pair of riding gloves wrapped in oiled cloth, a small leather-bound notebook with the looped C. Merritt on the inside cover, the pages closely written in pencil with diagrams of equine pasterns and feed proportions and case notes on respiratory complaints in 2-year-olds. The corners of the back pages dog-eared from 6 years of consultation in the dark by candle stub. a pair of stockings, darned at the heel. A clean apron she did not, on consideration, intend ever to put on again. Lady Beatrice helped. Lady Beatrice was not very useful at carrying, but she was extremely useful at moral support, and at talking the housekeeper into letting Charlotte have a second blanket from the linen press.
You look different, Merritt.
I look the same, my lady. You are not in your apron. I have been told that I do not have to be. You are wearing an emerald shawl. It belonged to my mother, my lady. Beatrice considered the small room with its narrow bed and its single window over the inner court, and its smell of saddle soap and warm leather. It is a very small room, Merritt. It is a very fine room, my lady. It has a key. My cousin, Beatrice said, in the tone of a child considering a serious diplomatic question, has had a box of books sent up from the library. He says he supposes you have been too long without a Stubbs, and he hopes you will accept the loan of his volumes. He had said it, Beatrice reported, to Pritchett. Pritchett had told the second footman. The second footman had told Cook. Cook had told her. Charlotte observed dryly that he had not, by the strictest accounting, said it to anyone, and that the entire household, nevertheless, knew. Beatrice agreed, in the satisfied tone of a child who had explained an obvious matter to a slightly slow adult. Charlotte set her uncle's valise on the foot of the bed. She set the notebook beside it. She set the leather gloves on top, where she could see them. The light from the high window was the cold, clear blue of an April afternoon, and it fell across the spines of the small box of books that the Duke had had carried up to her room. Stubbs, Marshall, Beringer on horsemanship, an old, much-thumbed copy of Bracken on equine veterinary medicine, and one volume she had not seen in 6 years. Her uncle's own privately printed Notes on the Conformation of the English Thoroughbred, the spine cracked from his own thumbing, the flyleaf inscribed in his own hand. To Theodore, who has the right hands. H.M., Newmarket, 1820. She sat down on the bed because her knees had stopped being reliable. Lady Beatrice climbed up beside her and took her hand. The child noticed, with the unsentimental observation of someone who had not yet learned that observations of this kind required tact, that Charlotte was crying. Charlotte said she was sitting. Beatrice corrected her, with the firm logic of 10 years old. She was sitting and her eyes were wet, which was crying. Charlotte amended her position. It was, she conceded, a sort of crying, but the sort that did not require attention. My cousin, said Beatrice, is not very good at saying he is sorry. He likes to send things instead. When he was sorry to me last Christmas for forgetting my birthday, he sent a pony. Charlotte told her, gently, that books were quite enough. Beatrice was not finished. With the casual cruelty of a 10-year-old reporting reconnaissance, she added that her cousin had also told Mrs. Thane that Charlotte was to take her meals in the small dining room from now on, with him and Beatrice. Charlotte answered that she would be taking her meals in the servants' hall with the rest of the staff. Beatrice nodded. He had said she would say that. He said, reported Beatrice, that you would say it, and I was to tell you that he hoped, in time, you might consent to dine in the small dining room on Sundays, when the staff has its half-day, and that he understood the weeks in between. Charlotte set her hand over her mouth. Beatrice asked, with the air of a child raising a delicate matter of state, whether Charlotte was going to marry her cousin. Charlotte said no. Beatrice asked why. Charlotte considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, and answered, because he had not asked her, and because if he had asked her, she would have told him that he was an ass who lifted maids onto stallions, and because she had a great deal of dignity to recover before she would accept a proposal from any man whatever, and because she was not finished being a stable assistant yet. Lady Beatrice considered all of this with the gravity of a small judge. She nodded. Sundays, Beatrice declared firmly. Charlotte would come to dinner on Sundays. Charlotte agreed, on Sundays, that she would dine with her. Beatrice pronounced this satisfactory and slid down off the bed. She would now, she announced, go and tell her cousin that Charlotte had accepted, on the condition that he was not an arse, and she walked out of the room in the considered, head-up manner of a small ambassador delivering a treaty. The door closed. Charlotte sat for a little while longer, with her hand on her uncle's notebook, and her mother's blue ribbon under her fingers, and her own private reflection that there were considerably worse things in the spring of one's 26th year than to be reinstated. 3 weeks later, the carriages began to arrive for the spring meeting at Raisby. Raisby was 40 miles south. It was the third great horse fair of the spring season, the one at which serious breeders compared serious stock and serious money was placed on serious wages, and the one to which Sir Lucian Halford had been issuing his letters of intent since the beginning of March. The Duke had, at Charlotte's request, kept his promise. Halford had been received in the morning room. Halford had been made to wait. Halford had been informed that the Duke's stable assistant was occupied. Halford had ridden away. Halford had then, 4 days later, written a public letter to the Sporting magazine, informing the readership of England that the Duke of Ravenhurst had taken an unusual interest in a particular kind of stable hand. The Duke had read the letter at breakfast. He had set down his tea. He had, very calmly, asked Charlotte whether she would do him the honour of accompanying him to Raisby in the capacity of his stable adviser, in such dress as she felt comfortable, on such terms as she herself would set. Charlotte had said yes. She had borrowed nothing. She had owned, in a small trunk at the bottom of her uncle's old valise, one riding habit. It was deep emerald green, cut high at the throat, military at the shoulder, narrow at the waist, and full at the skirt. And it had been made for her by her uncle's wife the spring before her uncle's last meeting at Tattersall's, when Charlotte had been 17 and had been intended, briefly, for a season in London. She had not worn it in 9 years. She had aired it 3 times by the backstairs window the week before, in the cold spring air, until the smell of cedar shavings had given way to the smell of green grass. She had let down the hem 1/2 inch, with stitches no governess would have praised, but no horse would have noticed. She had pinned a small jet brooch at the throat that had also been her mother's, and she had stood in front of the small square of looking-glass nailed to the back of her wardrobe door, and she had not, for a long, careful moment, been entirely certain who was looking back at her. The fairground at Raisby was set in a long green meadow on the south side of the village, ringed by hawthorn hedges that were just into their white May flower, with the auction ring at the centre, and a grand stand of weathered oak at the north end, and a refreshment booth, and a small brass band, and the canvas tents of 6 breeders stretched along the eastern hedge. The sky was the cool, clean blue of a morning that intended to behave itself. The grass underfoot was springy from the night's rain. The air smelled of clean horses and hawthorn, and the warm sugar of the booth's cakes. There were perhaps 300 people on the ground, most of them men, most of them in dark coats and high boots, most of them carrying riding crops, as if a riding crop was an item one ordinarily required at an outdoor breakfast. There were perhaps 30 women, of whom 4 had any business with the horses, and the rest were ornamental, and Charlotte registered each of these, briefly, the way a soldier registers cover before crossing a street. She walked into the courtyard at Raisby, on the Duke's arm, at 10:30 on a cold, bright Friday morning in May, and the small cluster of breeders who had been gathering by the auction ring went quiet in patches, the way grass goes quiet when a hawk crosses. Sir Lucian Halford was at the rail. He was 48 years old, and exceptionally good-looking in the way that a winter wolf is good-looking. Narrow, polished, exact, with very pale grey eyes and very dark hair, and the particular elegance of a man who had spent a great deal of money for a long time on not being mistaken for anyone else. He wore midnight blue. His cravat was edged in silver. He was holding a riding crop with one gloved hand and the price catalogue with the other, and he had been laughing at something a fat squire on his left had said when he saw the Duke walking towards him with Charlotte Merritt on his arm. The laugh stopped. "Ravenhurst," he said. "Halford. You have brought your stable adviser." "I have." "How extraordinarily egalitarian of you." "I find," said the Duke, with a polite small smile that did not reach his eyes, "that egalitarian arrangements yield superior livestock." Charlotte released the Duke's arm. She walked past Halford without looking at him. She walked along the rail of the auction ring, where a colt was being shown by a heavy-set groom, with a strap arranged across the animal's withers in a manner that any honest dealer would have recognized within 12 seconds. She stopped opposite the colt. She rested her gloved hands on the rail. She studied him for the slow count of 4. She turned her head a quarter of an inch and said, in a voice not raised, but pitched to carry exactly to the gentleman beside her, who was the buyer, "Sir, you might ask the gentleman to remove the strap." "The strap, miss?" "Across the withers, sir, under the saddle pad. It is keeping a small swelling from your eye. It is the swelling I should examine before I bid." The buyer was a wealthy farmer from Lincolnshire by the name of Mr. Endersley. Mr. Endersley had 8,000 a year and a deep distrust of London horsemen. He looked at Charlotte. He looked at the colt. He looked at the heavy-set groom, whose ears had gone pink. He turned to the auctioneer. "Have the strap off, sir, if you please." "Sir Lucian's man, have the strap off, sir, or I do not bid." The strap came off. The swelling, which was the size of a hen's egg, was visible to every man within 20 feet of the rail. It was the kind of swelling that, in a 4-year-old, indicated a developing splint, which indicated a horse that would be lame inside the year. Mr. Endersley closed his catalogue. "I do not bid, sir." "Mr. Endersley, good morning, sir." The colt was led away. The auction ring, which had been quietly noisy, was now quietly silent. Sir Lucian Halford had not moved from the rail. He was looking at Charlotte the way a man looks at a glass he has dropped, and which has, against probability, refused to break. He stepped towards her. "Miss Halford." The Duke had not moved either, but his voice cut across the air between them like a blade across leather. "I should like a private word with you, sir, in the course of the morning, by the south paddock, at your convenience. I shall wait." Halford's eyes did not leave Charlotte's face. "Ravenhurst." "At the south paddock, sir." A small, white silence. Sir Lucian Halford bowed, very slightly, in Charlotte's direction. He turned and walked towards the south paddock. Charlotte released the breath she had not, in the past 4 minutes, allowed herself to take. "Miss Merritt." "My lord." "That was beautifully done." "Thank you, my lord." "Will you walk with me to the colt sales?" "In a moment, my lord." She rested her gloved hand, briefly, on the rail of the auction ring. The wood was warm under her palm with the morning sun. She breathed. She steadied. She thought, distantly, of her Uncle Henry, who had taught her to spot a strap and swelling with the patience of a man teaching a daughter to read, and of the Friday afternoon at Tattersall's 6 years ago, when the same Sir Lucian Halford, with the same gloved hand, had pointed at a bay colt and announced to a crowd that the horse was sound, and had then collected his commission, and had ridden home, and had written a letter to a magazine that had ended her uncle's career, and broken her uncle's heart, and put her, Charlotte, into a kitchen pantry within a month. She had been 20 years old. She put her hand through the Duke's arm. She told him, without looking at him, that she would now like to walk to the colt sales. He glanced down at the gloved hand resting on his sleeve and observed, very gently, that it was shaking. She agreed, in a voice that did not change, but it was, and that it would not be shaking for very much longer. He set his other hand briefly over hers, the way a man steadies a flag in a small wind, and told her to take what time she needed. She thanked him with a half incline of her head. Halford caught her in the hour before the dinner bell. She had stepped away from the auction ring to find a glass of water at the small refreshment booth that had been set up by the grandstand. The Duke had gone to greet an old friend from Cambridge and had been delayed by the fat squire, who had cornered him about a brood mare. Charlotte had gone alone, which in any ordinary year of her life had been her preferred condition, and she had taken the glass of water and turned, and Sir Lucian Halford had been standing 2 feet from her, with his pale eyes very level, and his gloved hand resting on the silver head of a walking cane.
"Miss Merritt." "Sir, you have grown up." "It is an unavoidable consequence, sir, of time."
6 years.
6 years, sir."
"You have grown up rather well."
"Thank you, sir." He smiled.
It was the smile of a man who had practiced it. "I do wonder, Miss Merritt, what your Duke would think of certain particulars of your uncle's last year."
"He knows of them, sir."
"Does he know all of them?"
"All that there are, sir."
"Are you certain?"
"I am, sir."
"I am not." She set the glass of water down on the booth. She did not turn her body away from him. She did not look down. She had spent 6 years cleaning grates and emptying chamber pots and sleeping in attic rooms with 3 other women, and she had used those 6 years for several useful purposes, of which one had been the slow, patient, meditative practice of not allowing her face to register in the presence of men like Sir Lucian Halford.
"Sir," she said, "your concern for my uncle's posthumous reputation is touching. It is also 6 years overdue. If your lordship has anything material to add to the public record on the events at Tattersall's in the spring of 1820, I suggest you write a letter to the sporting magazine, as you so successfully did before."
"Miss Merritt."
"Sir."
"I could finish you with a sentence."
"Sir," said Charlotte, "you finished me with a sentence 6 years ago. I have, since then, become quite difficult to finish."
"Miss Merritt."
It was the Duke. He had stepped between them, quietly, the way a horseman steps between 2 animals who are working themselves up to bite. He was not raising his voice. He was not, in fact, even looking at Halford. He was looking at Charlotte.
"Miss Merritt, I have come to see whether you have eaten."
"I have not, my lord."
"I thought as much. Halford, if you will excuse us." "Ravenhurst! Halford!" The Duke did look at him then. "A word, sir, in private." "My lord, a word, Halford." "By the south paddock, as I said." A small, brittle silence. Then Halford bowed, the smallest correct bow of a man who had been cornered in his own preferred clearing, and stepped back. The Duke did not move until Halford had walked out of earshot. He turned. He took Charlotte's gloved hand. He lifted it briefly to his lips, in front of the small, interested crowd around the refreshment booth, and pressed a kiss against her knuckles. And the small, interested crowd became a small, enthralled crowd. And Charlotte Merritt felt, for the first time in 6 years, that she was not alone with what she had been carrying. He told her, quietly, that he was about to go and have a very direct conversation with Sir Lucian Halford, and that he would prefer she not be present for it. She tried to object. He told her it would not take long. She asked what he would say. He laid out his answer in the slow, careful tones of a man who had drafted it in his head 3 times that morning and intended to deliver it whole. He would tell Halford that the events of Tattersall's in the spring of 1820 were now under review by himself and by Lord Ashbury and by the Marquis of Bourne, all 3 of whom had written letters this past week at his request. He would tell Halford that the sporting magazine would be receiving a counter-statement in the next issue, signed by all 3. He would tell Halford that the next time he spoke her uncle's name in public, he had better be prepared to say it under oath. And he would tell Halford that the next time he addressed Charlotte in a corner of any horse fair in England, he would be answering to the Duke in the morning, with pistols.
"My lord."
"Charlotte, do you understand me?"
"Yes, my lord."
"Eat. I shall be back in 20 minutes. He went. Charlotte sat down at the small wooden table by the booth. She put her hands flat on the cold pine planks to stop them shaking. She watched the Duke walk across the green grass towards the south paddock, with the long stride of a man who had been about to do something for a very long time, and had finally been given the license to do it. 20 minutes later, He came back. Sir Lucian Halford had left the meeting and was already in his carriage, and the carriage was already on the London road. The Duke held out his arm. "Miss Merritt?"
"My lord."
"Will you walk back to the inn with me, through the meadow, the long way?" She put her hand through his arm. They walked. They walked through the long meadow that lay between the fairground and the inn, which was a quarter of an hour by the cart road and a half by the field path, and there was no one in it but a thrush in a hawthorn, and a pair of brown cattle, and the slanted yellow light of an English May afternoon. Charlotte did not speak for the first half of the walk. The Duke did not press her. At the kissing gate that opened onto the meadow proper, she stopped. She told him, quietly, with one gloved hand on the wooden gate bar, that she had been quite calm all morning, and that she found, now, that she was about to stop being calm. He told her, without hurry, that this was permissible. She said she would rather not be observed. He looked deliberately at the field, in which there was nothing observing them but a thrush in the white-flowered hawthorn, and informed her, with the same steady gentleness with which one might inform a horse that there was no need to shy at a passing leaf, that the thrush had poor opinions of all of them, and that its discretion could be relied upon. She laughed. It was the smallest laugh, and it was wet at the edges, and it was the first uncomplicated laugh she had laughed in his presence, and it broke the surface of her face open like a stone dropped into a still pond. She put her hand over her mouth. She turned her face away from him. The Duke set his hand on the small of her back, very gently, and did not move it. "Charlotte."
"My lord, I shall be all right in a moment."
"Take what time you need."
"My lord, I—"
"Take what time you need." She wept. Not for very long, not loudly. Just the slow, steady weeping of a woman who had been holding a thing for 6 years, and had set it down at last, and discovered, on setting it down, that she had not been aware of how much it had weighed. The Duke did not speak. He did not pull her into his arms. He did not produce a handkerchief at her, or recite her any speeches. He stood beside her at the kissing gate, with his hand on the small of her back, and he kept his hand there for the precise duration of her weeping, and not 1 second past it. When she stopped, she stood very still.
"My lord."
"Charlotte."
"I should like you to understand something."
"Yes."
"I am not crying because of Halford."
"No."
"I am crying because for 6 years I have been doing this without anyone behind me, and I had got rather used to it. And what I am finding this afternoon is that I am not as accustomed to it as I had supposed."
"Charlotte."
"My lord."
He turned her, very gently, to face him. "Miss Merritt, Charlotte, I want you to come home with me."
"My lord,
Not as a servant, not as a project, not as a matter on which my conscience requires repair, although it does. I would like you to come home with me as Charlotte, as yourself, as my master's niece, and as the woman who rode my unrideable stallion at first request, and as the woman who has just told Sir Lucian Halford that he is 6 years overdue, and as the woman whom I have not stopped looking at since the morning she laid the strand of mane in my hand and walked back to the kitchens."
"My lord."
"I am 30 seconds, Miss Merritt, from kissing you in this meadow. If you have any objection, this is the moment to raise it." She raised her face. The grey eyes met the storm-grey eyes. She thought, briefly, of her Uncle Henry, and of the wide blue April morning in the upper yard, and of the first laugh she had laughed in 6 years. And she said,
"My lord, I have no objection whatsoever."
He kissed her at the kissing gate, in a meadow in May, with the thrush watching from the hawthorn. It was the kind of kiss that, in audiobooks, you would not need described. A kiss restrained, charged, careful, and complete. The kind a man gives a woman when he's been quite certain about her for several weeks.
and has, that morning, killed a man's reputation on her behalf, and arrived punctual at the next thing. She set her gloved hands on his lapels. He set his on the small of her back, where he had been keeping them anyway. The thrush in the hawthorn approved. When he stopped, she said, "My lord." He said, "Theodore." She said, "Theodore." He said, "Charlotte, will you marry me?" She said, "Not in this meadow." "Where then?" "At Ravenhurst, my lord, in the chapel, when the foaling is done, and Hercules has won at York, and my uncle's name is back in the magazine. And on certain conditions." "Name them." "That I shall publish a treatise in my own name on the training of 2-year-olds before the year is out." "Yes." "That I shall keep my room off the saddle store and a key to it, and that I shall be at liberty to retreat there for a half-hour any afternoon I please, without explanation." "Yes." "That my uncle's name shall be inscribed in the family chapel, alongside your own father's." "Yes." "That I shall be addressed by Mr. Holloway and by every man in the stables as Miss Merritt, or Mrs. Kane, or Your Grace, as the case may be, but never, in any combination, as Sir." "Charlotte." "And that, my lord."
"Theodore."
"Theodore, that, for at least the first year of our marriage, I shall be permitted to muck out a stall when I am cross with you, as an alternative to throwing things." The Duke of Ravenhurst, who was holding her by the small of her back in a meadow in May, with a thrush approving from a hawthorn, and a kissing gate at his elbow, and a horse fair in the distance, and the rest of his life ahead of him, began to laugh. He laughed for a long time. He laughed until he had to set his forehead briefly against her shoulder. "Charlotte Merritt." "Yes, my lord." "I love you." "I know, my lord." "You will say it back in your own time." "In my own time, my lord." "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime, my lord, you will buy me a small dinner at the inn, because I have not yet eaten." "Charlotte." "Theodore." "Yes, my lord." She laughed. She turned. They walked. It was September before she set it back. It was September because she would not be hurried, and because the foaling had run on through May, and because Hercules had to be brought back to fitness and run at York in July, and because the sporting magazine had taken until August to print the counterstatement, and because the chapel at Ravenhurst had wanted painting, and because Lady Beatrice had insisted on writing the order of service herself, and because Mrs. Bickle had refused to use any cake recipe but her own, and because the new understable assistant, formerly a kitchen maid, formerly Miss Charlotte Merritt, had been very busy indeed. She said it on the morning of her wedding. They were walking through the upper yard. There was a small brown foal in the paddock beside Tempest's box. Tempest was leaning over the half-door, his great black neck stretched out, and Charlotte was passing him a rough wedge of carrot, and Theodore was watching her. And she turned, and she said, "Theodore." "Charlotte." "I love you." "I know." "You are an arse." "I know that as well." "You lifted me onto a stallion in front of 7 people." "I did." "You may consider yourself," she said, "humbled in perpetuity." He laughed. Tempest crunched the carrot. The dappled foal in the paddock came up to her hand and nudged at her sleeve, and Charlotte Kane, who had been Charlotte Merritt, who had been the niece of Henry Merritt of Newmarket, who had been a kitchen maid at Ravenhurst 11 months ago, and who was at the present moment the new Duchess of Ravenhurst, set her warm hand against the bridge of her stallion's great black nose, and the bridge of his nose was warm in the September sun, and she looked at her Duke, and her Duke looked back, and somewhere in the dovecote, a thrush, possibly the same thrush, certainly a relative, sang 4 clear notes into the morning. Mr. Holloway, watching from the doorway of the saddle store, took off his hat and held it against his chest
and said very softly to the small dappled foal who had wandered up to his elbow, "Aye, there she is." If you have ever been the woman the world overlooked, who knew exactly what no one had bothered to ask you, if you have ever quietly fixed something a far better paid man had missed, and walked away, and let the credit fall where it would, Charlotte's morning in the upper yard is for you. Tell me your favourite line in the comments. Was it the moment she went still in the saddle? Or the Duke standing in his shirt sleeves at the stable door at first light? And if you would like another story like this one, you know what to do. I shall see you at the next fireside.